I imagine that the very last person to survive the end of the world, as we now know it, will at some point turn around and say to nobody there at all, "Damn, but I guess it could be worse." It's a pretty darn universal coping strategy, I find, and an effective one. It demands that we take a step back from our circumstances to get a larger perspective, and it also insists that we muster some kind of gratitude for whatever we do have, somehow snapping us awake into an attitude of gratitude, if you will. In my work as an oncology chaplain at the Zambian UCLA Center for Integrative Oncology, I would say that the lion's share of the patients that I walk beside at some point along the way make some such version of that claim and take comfort in it. It could be worse. I'm so glad they caught the cancer early. I'm so grateful it hasn't metastasized. I'm happy I don't have to have radiation. Look, I've had 63 years of life. Look at these little kids who get cancer. I'm just glad it's me and not my wife or kids who has this. Like I say, it's an effective tool. I have this breast cancer patient, Margie. She's a feisty gal in her 70s with this sly, slightly devilish sense of humor. Somebody my mom would have described as a kick in the pants. Margie's also a bit of a busybody. She flits around the clinic, chatting up the other patients with her IV stand in tow. She's also designated herself as my agent of sorts. "Michael, you see that woman third chair from the window over there? I think she needs to talk to you after I'm done with you." One day, Margie opened with this declaration: "Michael, I'm a terrible person. It's true, but I use all these people. Isn't it awful? I talk to them, and after I hear their stories, I think, you know, Margie girl, you don't have it so bad after all. Isn't that terrible?" Now, her tongue was planted firmly in her cheek, but she was making a deadly serious point. She was speaking a profound truth for all of us, really, to that part of us that might find ourselves perhaps very aggravated to be the very last person in an impossibly long line at the bank, the supermarket, the DMV, and as soon as someone steps behind us in line, we feel better. The longer the line grows behind me, the better I feel. I'm not an inch closer to getting my business taken care of, but hey, at least I'm not where you are. Every time I turn around and look behind me, I feel a little bit better. Like it's some kind of spiritual Ponzi scheme or something. The thing about a Ponzi scheme, though, is that in order for it to work, somebody has to lose. Somebody has to be at the end of the line. Somebody has to be at the bottom of the pyramid, left holding the empty bag. And where does that leave us in our pursuit of a compassion-centered life? There's another aspect to the spiritual Ponzi scheme, and that is there's a prerequisite for buying in: a firm belief in the hierarchy of suffering. The whole idea that I can even know in any given circumstance who's suffering the most here, and so I will dole out my compassion accordingly. That idea can also trip us up in our pursuit of a compassion-centered life, because while I may feel terribly grateful that I'm now no longer the last person in line, I've just erected a barrier to experiencing an authentic kind of compassion for others and for myself, because I'm way too busy judging the suffering sweepstakes, figuring out where it is that I fit in the lineup. I want to say a few things about compassion itself. The word has as its Latin root compati, which simply means with suffering, to be with it. Not to compare it, advise it, correct it, feel bad about it, feel grateful I'm not suffering as much as you are, just to be with it. It's not a small or easy thing. Virtually every religious tradition on the planet upholds compassion as a revered virtue. Isn't it ironic that we consider it virtuous to feel compassion for another, and yet to feel compassion for ourselves, we would judge that rather harshly. Even moralize about it, call it self-pity. We don't want any of that. And I think we all know the difference between one, perhaps, who's very attached to victimhood as a way of navigating through life, and one who can truly honor the reality that, hey, I'm going through a tough time here. I would ask, can we really walk beside another in their suffering in an authentically compassionate way unless we first know how to carry and walk with our own suffering? A number of years ago, one of the chemo infusion nurses referred me to Valerie on her first day of chemotherapy. Valerie was 36 at the time, a working mom with a 9-year-old daughter at home, newly diagnosed with breast cancer. The core of Valerie's spiritual distress, far more than her diagnosis, was hearing the news that she could no longer bear children. She and her husband were desperately trying to get pregnant at the time of her diagnosis. Valerie was also growing very weary of trying to keep spiritual scorecards. I know, Michael, I should feel grateful. I have one healthy child, right? And I have a wonderful husband, and I have great insurance, and hey, it's not like we're starving in Africa or something. Why is it that Africa is always at the bottom, in the default position of our spiritual Ponzi scheme pyramid? Valerie was also growing very impatient with those in her world who wanted to keep that spiritual scorecard for her, on her behalf. Valerie, look at it this way. Do you know how many couples can't have even one child? You should feel grateful and count your blessings. No one in her world was simply allowing her to experience her loss, to be present and witness her grief with compassion. The thing is, I believe we pay a price, individually and collectively, when we choose to go through our life's journey without sharing the pain of that journey, without complaint, if you will, as much as we would also want to share its joys, pleasures, successes. We deny life around us from truly knowing what it's like to be us, and we keep true intimacy at arm's length. If only the last person in line, if only the cancer patient, if only the person starving in Africa is entitled to our compassion, is entitled to complain, what on earth would the rest of us talk about? Like Jane Wagner says, I personally believe we developed language because of our deep inner need to complain. Now, I'm certainly not advocating we should all complain 24/7, all complaining all the time, as if some of us don't already. But I am inviting us to reflect on our capacity to be truly present to one another's circumstances and suffering, including our own, without the need to judge or compare or put it on our own hierarchy of suffering scale. Can we meet each circumstance as it is in all of its complexity and contradiction? Many years ago, I had a leukemia patient, Lorne, from Bakersfield, in and out of the hospital a dozen times over the course of 2 years. His wife, Mary, by his side every step of the way. These are hardworking blue-collar folks for whom the cost of parking alone at UCLA proved quite daunting. There were so many times in that 2 years when Lorne came close to death. I was paged to come up to the ICU, say a prayer, offer some comfort, and the guy bounced. He kept bouncing miraculously. Toward the end, it became clear there wasn't much bounce left and the end would be near. And Mary confided in me, Michael, don't get me wrong. I love my husband. I'm so grateful for every moment I have with him. But I also have to say that every day he's lingering now is costing me another $150 at the motel, and I don't know how I'm going to pay it. Does that make me a terrible person to be worried about that now? Like Mary, we all live in multiple realities at the same time. The image that comes to my mind is of a Best Buy store, some such place where they sell television monitors. Imagine, if you will, a wall full of TV screens, each one tuned to a different show. That whole wall of TV shows is rather like an image of our individual and collective lives. And each show, whether it's a situation comedy, a drama, the news, a documentary, or a cartoon, has its own reality, its own context, its own goals, its own morality. None is intrinsically more legitimate than another. It just is the reality that it is. And no one show captures all of our lives in all of their complexity. Maybe the whole wall of TV shows is the best illustration of that. And yet, through our buy-in to the spiritual Ponzi scheme and our belief in the hierarchy of suffering, we somehow think we do know which shows are the most legitimate and worthy of our attention. That same part of us that might silently judge Mary, if only for a moment, how could she be concerned about money at a time like this with her husband dying? That is until we're slapped awake and find ourselves in an entirely different TV show altogether. Many years ago, I worked on a conference with a colleague, Amanda, whom I had just met. In getting acquainted with Amanda, she was telling me about her marriage of 30-plus years that had been largely happy, But she said, Michael, there's been a thorn in my side for 30 years. Our carport. My husband has had it stacked to the rafters with crap for 30 years. I'm sick of looking at it. I was sick of fighting with him about it. I was sick of wrestling with my own feelings about it. Let it go, Amanda. It's just stuff. It doesn't matter. Damn it, it matters. I get that. But you know what? He surprised me, and he had it covered with siding. And now I don't have to look at his crap anymore. You can't believe the difference it's made in our marriage. I get that too. 6 months later, I worked with Amanda on another conference, only to find out that her house and her carport had been swallowed up in a brush fire. 30 years of irritation, poof, where is it now? It's simply a different TV show. Earlier, I mentioned Africa in the default position at the bottom of our spiritual Ponzi scheme pyramid. A number of years ago, my husband Scott and I got to travel to South Africa and to Zambia. And in Zambia, we visited this small village of about 3,000 people situated on this gentle hillside. Everybody lived in mud huts, no electricity, no plumbing, no running water. A couple of hand pumps like this at the bottom of the hill, to which all the villagers had to trudge multiple times a day, buckets in hand, for all of their water needs, if you can imagine. Impoverishment by any standard we would know. And yet there were geraniums planted in bleach bottles cut in half, framing the doorways of the cottages. There were dogs and cats kept as beloved family pets. There was a spirit big enough to contain extraneous beauty, geraniums, dogs and cats. There was a humbling kind of hospitality shown to this wealthy American who was so busy taking video that he didn't notice the bucket of water at his feet before he kicked it over. Mortified, I asked our host, can I please go down the hill and pump you some more water? He only laughed at me. Of course not, you're our guest. Now, I certainly don't mean to imply that there was not significant suffering going on in that village, and so somehow we are off the moral hook for all of our prosperity and consumption of the world's resources. But it does make me wonder, is it possible with the Zambian village show that there might be a kind of simplicity and a clarity, a comprehensibility, if you will, that's missing from, say, the Carport is Driving Me Crazy show? Is it possible that in some ways the suffering may be less? Because I will tell you, when I left that village, I left not with so much gratitude in my heart for all my advantage and privilege, as much as I did with longing for some of what they had. For what? For an apparent deep sense of peace and acceptance with one's place in the world, in one's community, in one's family. For freely given smiles. For that generous kind of hospitality. Maybe it's best just not to judge the TV show. The Buddhists offer the concept of beginner's mind, coming to each situation we find ourselves in with the mind of a beginner. I know nothing, as a way of being awake and available to discovery, new ideas. What if we came to each TV show we see with beginner's mind? And what if suffering is just suffering, and the flavor of that suffering just depends on the TV show? I would suggest when a 2-year-old drops her ice cream cone and cries about it, her suffering is as real as you or I getting a diagnosis of cancer. We can judge her and admonish her. Stop your crying, it's just an ice cream cone, I'll get you another one. But in her mind, I don't want another one. I wanted that one. And I feel foolish for having been careless with something so precious to me, and I don't have any language skills yet to articulate any of the nuances of these feelings, so I'm just going to wail. A number of years ago, before my husband Scott retired, he was doing a lot of traveling for work. And in order to save money on taxis and airport parking, I was making a lot of trips back and forth to LAX. Now, I do need to stop and say Scott loves to wrap gifts. He wraps the most exquisite gifts you've ever seen. It's part of how he expresses his creativity and his love and generosity. It's an event to get a gift from Scott. Well, one Sunday in December, Scott was flying home from a business trip to Chicago. And while in Chicago, he went to one of his favorite shops to buy some very special wrapping paper to wrap all the gifts he had carefully selected for his staff for the holiday office party, which was to be in LA the next day. It being December, in Chicago, his flight was many hours late. He's sitting at the gate endlessly, dozing on and off. His flight's finally called. He gets up to go to the gate and discovers the bag of wrapping paper that had been sitting at his feet was gone, stolen. Frantic, he asks the woman sitting across from him, "Did you see anybody take my wrapping paper?" "Well, yes, I did, but I didn't think a man would be traveling with wrapping paper." Great. Now on top of the loss, he gets a sexist, homophobic slur thrown in for the bargain. So when he finally lands in LA, it's close to midnight. He's got maybe one good nerve left, and I've got two. And with the best of intention, but not with any authentic compassion, I gently made the suggestion, "Honey, maybe we could go to the all-night Rite Aid, and we could find some paper that would work." Oh, the look he gave me. It would be as if the Queen of England were coming to our house for dinner, but the oven's broken, so why don't you go to McDonald's and pick something up? It just wouldn't do. And it was very tempting to play the chaplain card in that moment. "Scott, it's wrapping paper. It's not cancer. You want to hear about the patient I saw on Friday?" Is that what compassion looks like? The fact is, he was enduring a significant loss. He lost his once-a-year opportunity to show his staff in his own inimitable, creative, generous way how much they mean to him. And it was taken from him. Granted, in the scheme of things, it's not that big a deal. Scott would be the first to admit it. But in that very moment, isn't it a little ridiculous to compare the wrapping paper show with the cancer show, or the Zambian village show, or even the Carport is Driving Me Crazy show? The thing is, we've got a choice to make. I would ask myself, can I be fully present in whatever situation I find myself in now with compassion, whether it's the "shit, I spilled bleach on my favorite pants" show, or it's the "my God, my mother has lung cancer" show? Can I be fully aware at any given moment that there's maybe a dozen shows going on around me in which I am also appearing at this very moment? Just like Mary, who was in the "My Husband is Dying" show, in the same moment she's in the "How will I pay my visa bill" show. Can I also be fully cognizant that at any given moment there are an infinite number of shows going on around me in which I make no appearance at all? Foreign territory. Perhaps if I'm truly serious about creating a compassion-focused life, my spiritual practice ought to be to watch as many TV shows as possible with beginner's mind. Maybe then I can inch closer and closer to a truly inclusive kind of spirituality that would have compassion at its center. And if not, well, it could be worse. Thank you.